Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you join us here for our Human Resource Management section. What I added the subtitle of the new normal. I know that's a phrase we've been hearing quite a bit and might seem overused, but I think we all agree that's where we are right now when it comes to anything, when it comes to employee relations, human resources, or the work we do. I'm Karen Souza, Human Resource Director and Training and Certification Director at CTAA. And I'm very happy to have joining me today my colleague, Will Reckley. And Will is a program associate with the National Center for Mobility Management. Some of you know it as NCMM, to support us in helping to moderate this course. I recognize that many of you joining us on this call either come from the world of, I do human resource management, that's what I know, I work with all the time. I might even be working with a team of people, that's my responsibility. I also certainly recognize that some of you on the call wearing so many hats would also be joining us where that's not the only focus of what you do and your responsibilities. Yet when we look at the importance of human resource management and as the foundation for everything that connects us in our time of providing service in our communities and keeping safety at the forefront for our staff and people using our service, we know we're the connector to what's going on in our organizations. So welcome and happy to have you here. I also want to let you know a little bit of background that you've heard earlier if you joined us at the general session, but a reminder about this session and our Zoom meeting format. As you already know, all of our participants were muted upon joining us on this call, but there's a few reminders about Zoom. First, please keep yourself muted throughout this session unless you're called on, and please use the chat box that we have for your questions. As our moderator, Will bring forward as he can these questions for us to make sure that we're responding to them. Another thing, you can type your questions right in the chat box. You can also, if you feel you want to comment on something that's been said or a question that somebody else typed and you feel comfortable in commenting, you're certainly welcome to do that, as this is an interactive session, which is good. You're not going to hear just me talking and having it be one-sided. And I think the last important thing to know about our session together today is that in using the chat box, if you put your name and your agency name, if you'd like to speak and not just use the chat box, then in seeing your name and agency name, we'll get to a point where we'll unmute you and allow you to ask that question to us in that way instead of only the chat box. It's certainly up to you, chat box or not, reply in the box or not, and have us unmute you when you put your name and your agency name. So that's the overview of how we're going to use Zoom today. We'll also be putting some very important links to vital resources in the chat box during this particular session. And don't worry, everything that we're doing with each other is being recorded and will be available after we complete our conference. So I welcome you to join us and participate and be a part of our focus on human resources. My contact information is here. If after this you have any follow-up for me, to reach me by whatever way works best for you. And so there's three major areas that we're going to focus on today for human resource management, since there's so much, but we have to narrow it down. And sharing this with you, I want to let you know that our three major areas are, first, COVID-19, which you would expect within personnel policies and procedures and human resource, and giving you links as we start to talk about each of these briefly. The next area will be on hiring, recruiting, and social media. And the third major area is about senior leadership and succession planning. We came up with these three areas because of the conversations that our staff and I have been having with many of you in the field, and that's how we brought this together. Some of you on this meeting right now also replied to a survey that we sent out at the end of last week about this human resource topic, where we asked about 5 questions of you. And I will be including some of that into what we're talking about today as well. So if you did reply to that survey, you'll see that's coming forward as part of this. And even if you didn't, what the responses and questions were, I know will make sense to you. So we're ready to begin. Updating personnel policies. I know, and 2 months ago in June, when we held CTA's virtual expo, that when we brought into a panel discussion one of the Sun members, Josh Baker with Beaver County Area Regional Transit Authority, and Lynn Hellegard with Missoula Ravalli TMA with the rural perspective, that conversation and looking at a total of 12 topics that we discussed is something you might want to look at the end of this session as well. So Will has put up the link to that recording that was 1 hour and 15 minutes, where authentically 2 HR directors and myself talked about all 13 of these, or 12 or 13 of these topics in great detail. So when you have the time, if you or someone else want to look at it and get into that detail, it's there. First, for updating our policies and any work you may have currently been considering, we know it's not just a personnel policy manual, but it's also the employee handbook that we've had to coming back to work and having these policies around a pandemic policy and procedures are meant to support us, help the rest of our leadership in the organization know the approach and feel comfortable with it, as much as putting it and updating a handbook. So the first part is telework or telecommuting. I know that's terms that we all recognize and can be interchangeable. And there's a link to information with an overview of policy around that, knowing each of your organizations is so different. But I thought I'd share with you something interesting that one of your colleagues told me, an HR director. They said, for the first time, we're looking at telework for dispatchers. I said, really? Tell me more about that. That's not something I expected to hear. And they said, yes, we're looking at it. Of course, the technology, fortunately, is available for us to make this work. But at the same time, my organization and some of the requirements during this COVID-19 have meant looking at every job, like all of us are, in a different way. So she said they're working on that with the dispatching staff right now. I told her to let me know how it goes when it's done. So if any of you are interested in something as unique as, unless some of you are doing it now and want to share it with us, which would be wonderful. But that was something different than I had been hearing about telework than typically administrative staff when it comes to that. So OSHA and COVID-19 and reporting anything that occurs that's required under OSHA, for those of you who are covered by OSHA, and the link and resource of how to do that and the requirements, I think it's critical for all of us to think about, where do I get great resources, Karen? As things keep getting updated, as new information comes out, we all, I would say, should be a member, like CTA is, and I think probably most of you are, of the national organization SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management, shrm.org. That's the resource that I go to during this COVID time to help answer questions from the field, to help CTA what we're doing. And I think if you are a member, you know that. And if you are, you would also want to connect to your own local chapter as well. But they're a fantastic resource. And every day I'm getting an email newsletter. Here's the newest things around COVID-19, almost every day. And they do a lot of webinars and so forth. So that's a great resource. After that, number 4, the ADA policies and reasonable accommodation, and the link to information around that. Privacy and HIPAA is a pain point that many of you in the survey question that we sent out about what are your concerns around COVID-19 as it relates to your operations. That was one of the key areas many of you mentioned. About 45 of you responded to the survey. And that was toward the top of the list of responses. And then the link to that leads us next to Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and screening for COVID-19. So the CARES Act and what we're practically trying to do every day and our responsibilities and these tools to allow us to review what we currently have and how we have to create something that's a common sense look at policies and procedures around a pandemic. I say that because we might have policies in the past that went around something like the flu, sick leave, annual leave, use of it, all those practical parts of policies, but now we're putting it within this unique context to apply to this situation. The last group about personnel policies is your hiring practices and procedures. Annual leave is another item that was brought up by many of you. Some people have a use it by a certain date leave policy. And what happens now when nobody is really able or wants to take their leave and they're accumulating it, and we don't have anything currently in our policies that allow for any flexibility on that, but should we? Who do we address this with? What do we want to agree to? So that's part of, I'm sure, discussions you all are having. The Family Medical Leave Act and the CARES Act and that intersection of what is elevated from the CARES Act beyond the standard FMLA that we knew that applied for those of you with 50 or more employees in the past. And that linked to very practical information around that. That was another group of the top 4 responses I got. Your drug and alcohol policies. Many of you shared with me, and I'm hoping it's better now, that either background checks or access to labs, when labs are doing a lot of work around COVID testing and trying to get this completed in a timely manner. The Federal Transit Administration, there's a link within the information about what to do with background checks if they're delayed and still being able to hire someone while the background check is still in process. And what does the Federal Transit Administration allow around that? You can see that resource and what they say is to be done in this circumstance. Not everyone we know took advantage on number 11 to the personnel policy PPP part and connecting with the CARES Act. So I won't go too much into that really at all, but for those of you who did, there's a good resource to that. And all of this is around workplace safety, as we know, the most critical part for what you're all doing. So I'm hoping that those resources help you. So to just conclude some thoughts around these points that you're seeing here that I'm not verbally going into great detail on. And when you look at those links and are opening them up, if they apply to something you wanted to know more about, the survey from the 45 people in this order said these were the major things that they are having concerns about. So it might resonate with you and you say, I'm thinking the same thing, Karen. Privacy, helping employees feel safe, mental health, burnout, and the impact on morale. Policy and best practices. And I also hear many people saying, but our organization wants to do the right thing. And are our policies and procedures not as flexible to that? And how do we go ahead and update in certain areas if we feel we need to? Not just how, but how do we take this on and get it into a handbook so all employees see it and are aware of it? Safety and communication, both for new people being hired and certainly for the current employees. Potential for exposure and providing service. Contact tracing when we've never had to do that before, and how this just changes our whole work environment and the impact for all of us. So having brought these kind of common survey question responses and this information, I am going to pose a question that I think is an important consideration around COVID-19. Sick time and how it's taken under the CARES Act requirement, concern that some have about abuse of leave, when employees need to take care of children or family, and how do I structure remote work when it's available around that? And then the real question also is, how do we handle in this revised policy that we've either completed or are still working on and incorporated in my handbook, how do we make sure what we always want to make sure, which is that everyone's aware of this? How is our leadership team confirming that this is not only being given to our employees, but explained, because it's going to have a lot of questions that we all know around this. It just does. So, you know, how some people say even what I put in my policy, if I have a state mandate that says every employee must wear a mask and suddenly someone refuses to wear one, and it's a state mandate as much as what we're saying at our agency, practical things like that. So I didn't know if I stopped for a moment, Will, is there anyone who at the moment who has anything they were either wanting to ask questions of or comment on to share?
We don't have anything in the chat box now, but this is a great opportunity to remind people. So if you have an answer to any of those questions, please just alert us to it and we will call on you and you can share. We have a pretty good sized group for some conversation here.
So looking at the resource links when you have a chance, if you're not doing it now, and my reminder that I culled all this volumes of information from the SHRM organization to get it to the essentials and keep it practical, to keep it at a best practice level, to keep knowing that when you go to that website, you can expand on anything, as always, more about that. I think we all get the idea around that. Another part of looking at our workforce and reintegrating our workforce for some of us who, and most of us are still at that phase of, we're not providing as much service, Karen. Some of us may have had to lay off people, maybe never having done it before. This might be your first time. Maybe instead you went the route of furloughing, and furloughing and laying off are actually two different things. And maybe that's what you needed to do. Maybe instead it is the telework going on for certain employees, and now it's that slow integration. And then some of us, unfortunately, started to open up and we've had to take a step back through what's going on in our state, and we aren't able to keep moving forward. So those questions that I put here are just to have you reflect on it on this page. I know you can read it yourselves. I won't read it out loud for you. But this was just what I was hearing in my conversations of many people saying, I've got to work on a new structure around this, at least during this pandemic time. It doesn't mean I'm going to have it be something permanent, but I'll be prepared if the worst case happened again. So even the parts of looking at COVID-19 of having a common area, if you're doing temperature checks before anyone reports in and potentially exposes anyone else, who is assigned to do that, you know, all that safety and protection. And I put it in the overview of our next topic about, for the first time, we might be able to interview or recruit more people than we've had an opportunity to before in this country. And in trying to explain our work environment, how it functions safely, and putting that forward is as important, like we say, for people currently working for us, considering coming back as you're asking them to. People currently working there who may have started there, and then the new people who you're trying to bring on board, either because people have decided not to come back. That might be the case. Or you need a position temporarily filled till someone can come back based on your particular circumstances. So all this part of authenticity during a hard time, and let's just say, what's the 3 most important words in HR right now during COVID-19? communicate, communicate, communicate. We can't do it enough. We want to be, and our whole goal is to always be as transparent, and that's not a cliche here at all. I'm reminding us of things that I know all of you are very much have at the front of your mind, are very aware of, but sometimes it's training the other leaders overseeing other areas, because it's not just on our shoulders, of course, it's a team, it's our whole team. So how are we making sure that everyone who is answering to employees, whether it's remotely, whether it's Zoom meetings they're conducting, whether it is something where they're returning to work, that we keep that communication more than we ever have before in all kinds of ways. Do you have a newsletter you created that you never needed to before for your internal staff to keep things coming in some kind of positive way that way? Is your staff and your community someone who uses Facebook a lot? I mean, whatever method or methods that you're going with, that's part of what I'm hearing from HR directors saying. We have to keep that message going and keep it at a steady pace. The other considerations I move forward on this new screen, just to continue that overview of reintegrating your workforce. I think many organizations I learned said their information technology policies and how remote work was meant to function wasn't at all something that was in writing, wasn't something they realized that everyone had if they needed to do something with a printer, let's say, as much as what they do on their laptop or computer at home. Does that mean the employee pays for it? Does the organization pay for it if it's needed for that responsibility? Many people told me, I thought we were, when everyone has a computer at home all ready to go, and I had some surprises there. And that's understandable, I think. But how do we look at this going forward as part of that discussion and consideration as well? Who doesn't like, when we're looking at COVID-19, to think there's some kind of checklist to make sure I didn't forget something in what I'm looking at? And so these 10 bullet items here, there is what Will has also a link to this exact checklist with, it's just a matter with a little description of each of these 10 items. And so it gives you, in a matter of like 2 pages, I think, it might be another little bit of something, a real good, thoughtful consideration of each of these points and how are we doing to all those areas that apply to your organization. So it's brief, it's to the point, but it keeps you on track with a nice checklist and all the steps that we should all be considering when it comes within the context of COVID-19. So I hope you'll find that resource is something that supplements or complements what you're doing currently. Is there anything coming through, Will, at this moment for COVID-19, or anything we've given highlights to and links to?
Nothing yet. I think.
All right. Okay. I didn't want to move and leave anyone behind. We are going to come back to some general questions and some other discussions as well. So I do want to let you know that. We're going to move now then, looking at the next area, which is hiring, recruiting, and social media, and how that we look at that when we're trying to reach out. And we did this poll as part of the 5 questions that went out that I mentioned to anybody who registered early for the HR class. And we just asked, you know, how many of you use social media to recruit for your open positions? And so out of the 42 or so that responded, you can see that very small amount of people said we don't use social media at all, and most of you do. And I know that you would expect when people responded, their answers were very practical and very common. The first part is using our own website and using Twitter and Facebook. Yes, all these things that are Indeed.com and ZipRecruiter, Craigslist, and even the online local newspaper to go placing an ad, not just in a paper format, but using the online newspaper. Interesting ones I haven't heard of before, I thought I'd share with you. Someone has a driving school located near them. And so they contacted the driving school and they said, set up a kind of program where they have an incentive to someone who's hired by the driving school talking about their transit agency and their need for drivers. And if that person stays and meets that period of time, they're giving that driving school people a bonus, or whatever you want to call it, a recognition that this person was employed by us and made it past probation. Little unique, interesting. I kind of liked it. Why not? An employee referral program. Several of you say you have that kind of program that connects with the word of mouth, but the person passing probation, same idea. And then money being given for that employee referral that's hired. And during this time of financial crisis for many people, especially employees as well, that would be a good program. Virtual job fairs. I don't know how many of you do participate in job fairs. Don't forget, we can always hold our own job fair. We don't only need to have some other group coming together, but some people have taken that virtually and put the word out through social media, and they have brought other of their colleagues to immediately do interviews, quick interviews of a couple of things they go over with everyone, and do a first interview that way, and then follow up for those they want to work with. So a virtual job fair. And some of the Chamber of Commerce's have an online newsletter, and they've connected with those. So interviews by phone and video chat are new to many of us. That isn't at all how most HR people would say to this point that they had a standard protocol to do that. Most people, when I train the class on recruiting and retaining drivers over these many years, have said to me, I like face-to-face the best, Karen, for many reasons. And I always say, well, don't lose anyone. If you need to get them on the phone because they seem like a good candidate, have a list of interview questions. You and I and all of us on this phone, or HR people, or have that responsibility, I think would say, I recognize this is how people want and have to talk with us. Not everyone is meant to come in or wants to come in or knows our protocol of safety and cleanliness yet. So they're trying to figure things out, and that's our first impression, so we do it that way. Traditionally in transit, the largest aggregator of job seekers across the country is Indeed. And that's the percentage of transit people who are looking for jobs, and that's where they go. And then you see proportionally as it goes smaller and smaller to some of these that you may or may not be using yourself. Whatever works for you is what matters, we know. Indeed and ZipRecruiter and others certainly have ways to post your information for free. But how do we make it stand out so that somebody notices our job? That's the important part. Because whether you're paying a fee to those sites and having their professional Indeed or other staff helping you make your job description and your resumes and links and everything move up and be seen, there's much we can do on our own without paying a fee, but we have to be willing to do it. So we're going to look at that for a moment here coming up. So this is how I have learned by interviewing senior people at the largest recruiting sites like Indeed and others, how transit drivers look for employment. Most of them are using their phones. That shouldn't be a surprise to us, since that's the world that most drivers connect to. So how does what we currently have out on social media, have you been looking at it on your phone as well? Not just your laptop, not just a tablet, but how it looks on the phone and how it's sized within that. So they're searching mostly through their phone. And if you, which we all want to do, have a link to our social media that links to an employment application. If it takes more than 5 minutes to complete that application online, and most of them, by the way, I learned, are bailing out after 3 minutes, but they will not take more than 5 minutes, and they will leave that link and their data behind the scenes, because you know there's amazing things that are looked at behind the scenes by these aggregating companies. They say they will never come back to your web page, never come back in 85% of the cases. That's pretty significant. So when transit drivers are looking for employment when we're out of this COVID-19 new normal, this is the look and this is how they do it for future look. And most of it, I don't know why any driver would look at it any differently, even during COVID times. So in having that background that we've learned, what I also learned is that branding your transit agency isn't your mission statement. It isn't if you have a vision statement. Those are all critical pieces of your organization, and it's the foundation of who you are and what you do. But what they say is you have to speak to the audience the way they want to see things, and it's in small bites, not a lot of words. And if you can link it to a video of some type to support the words and let it be seen that way, all to the better. We now have learned during this time of COVID-19 that many agencies have had older workers working for them. And many of them, because of this pandemic, are not able to come back, or are, though they want to, but certain circumstances around this pandemic don't allow them, and it's not something they can do. Or have decided, I'm not going to return to work at all. This has led me to retirement now, to not reporting back to work. That's the circumstance. We are always trying to get a mixture of diversity reflecting our communities. I know all of us have that on us that we're trying to do. But the branding of your transit agency that's identified by these social media platforms is saying that in a brief way, you want to identify something about your mission and your agency that really speaks quickly to someone looking at your website. If you do not use social media to search for jobs because you've never had to, and you don't have a lot of turnover, and even if you do, social media is, people are looking for jobs not the way newspaper ads did in my generation, by a job title only, or a location, where are jobs in this community. The way that social media people are looking are word searches, keywords. So to show what we mean by that, looking at this branding that goes at the very top of your social media page for that first impression is, you want to link to a short employment application. If you right now say to yourself what I said, which is the application we have online today would take from 3 to 5 minutes to fill out, then shorten to the essentials. And if you want to talk to someone and interview them, you can send them the longer application and let them fill out everything you need and get all those things you must have. I'm not telling you to change what you must have to hire someone. I'm just saying initially, a short application to fill out, get just what you need. That's enough for you to know yes or no, and some other critical things, and keep it within that time frame. Take your iPhone, set the clock, have one of your friends or your family or yourself try to fill out that application, and really make sure it's less than that amount of time, not just try to guess it. Mobile app ready, like I said. To brand your company, these are two of your peer transit agencies that when we did a branding exercise, that at that point, they came up with these very quick taglines, for example, transit agency brands. I will say these out loud. One of them came up with working with a team of their drivers and staff throughout their whole organization, pulled a small group together, did this exercise, and they came up with proudly serving the public by moving people forward. The other brand you see that another group came up with, another agency, was we provide mobility for all, ... for life. Keywords are what people now use in social media, as I said, to look for jobs. I'm going to show you coming up here an example of what was rated by Indeed and the other two social media programs I reached out to tell me, I asked them, what are the top best transit agency ads that you have seen that did the best pull and responses and truly embody a social media approach to promoting that particular description of a job. And so I'll be showing you an example of that. And the keywords that I bolded out that people hit on that we're looking as well. A bad application process, nobody wants to eliminate any candidates. So when we take that branding, whether it's for our fixed route drivers, our ADA drivers, or I recommend ads should be separate, which I think pretty much everyone I see does it that way. That online video part I talked about isn't meant to spend a lot of money, isn't meant to be professional. Quite frankly, the two at the bottom of this page, demand response ADA, it says SRC paratransit. If you put in Google and put SRC paratransit and do a search, SRC paratransit driver job, it will come up with a brief, a minute 30-second video that I think is authentic, very realistic, and it shows you an example of something you could take your iPhone and buy one of those little stands and stand it up and show your drivers doing a few things and not get into anything sophisticated. But it really shows very clearly what it means to do a job when it comes to ADA service. It shows the vehicle, it shows getting someone up the ramp, all those things you would expect if you were trying to understand that aspect of what that job is like in the mini video. The fixed route MTA Maryland one, if you did a search on that and put that into Google, you would also see an example of a fixed route example. You might say, I hope you do, we already have something like that. And so where is it featured? Is it front and forward now? Did it get lost on your website? Is it, at the top of your ad? Someone who is very concerned during COVID-19 of the safety, like everybody is, and is applying for a job inside, not just driver, or outside or your organization, I would do this video of all different parts of my agency and how it works. Because when it comes to a social media ad, the top rated ad that I was told when I met with them was this ad from Ride Connection in Portland, Oregon. I'll be quiet now and let you read this ad. And remember, the bolded words are the word search that people were using who were drivers, not just a title, not just a responsibility. And I'll let you read that for a moment. Now, before I come back to this, I'll bring it back in a moment. I'm going to show you another version of an attention-grabbing overview, meant to really have someone look at it, where I'm showing you the typical transit ad when I am asked to work with an agency and look at how they're currently promoting their openings. And then the version we worked with, and I said, let's try this approach of a social media approach to this. And that's the next thing you're going to look at coming up below. The original wording of it, and then under try, how we changed it completely. I'm hoping that you agree that the ad below is something that when someone, especially who hasn't worked in the industry or doesn't know it, would be welcoming to me, that would be my impression, is uplifting in this description. I mean, I really genuinely feel that. And you can tell me and interview me and ask me all the questions you will after I respond back to you, because I have a lot of questions. It looks great. I do need to know more, and you want me to know more, and you're going to ask me questions, and you'll do all those things that we always do. But that first one to me would have read like white noise. I mean, truly, I would have looked at that and read maybe the first sentence if you were lucky, and it would have began to read to me like blah, 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 blah. And when I'm sitting with someone and we're going over ads, they kind of chuckle with me and say, I guess you're kind of right there. I said, doesn't matter that I'm right. It matters whether you feel how you word something is welcoming and wanting people to open it and look at it and know more. So going back a moment to that other ad that was there for Ride Connection, I called them and talked with them more about how did they design this, what did they do, how did they come up with this. They said it's not as easy. Nobody would say it's easy, but they did engage in their organization the drivers. They have a driver council there. They said to the drivers, will you look at our ads? Be brutally honest. If you saw this, when I show you this format and that format, would you be replying today if you were looking for a job? They got the answer they wanted and expected, and then they worked it from there and engaged them throughout the whole time of redoing this, and not just having the leaders being the one designing and thinking this way. So it empowered the drivers to feel their opinions are valued, they said, of course, and it also led to this pickup. So again, remember in social media, drivers and anyone else for any position are doing word searches and not just title searches in the traditional way. Some are doing title searches. I'm not dismissing that. But remember also in title searches that if someone is not in the industry, if you're saying you're looking for paratransit or ADA, I have no idea what that means. I will never open up the ad and respond to it. We have to sometimes title things a little bit differently when we're putting titles in, because that's the other feedback I got from the aggregators of this data. You get very few openings anytime an ad is put up saying looking for a paratransit driver or an ADA driver, unless clearly it seems to us, seeing the little amount of views, let alone even less openings, only people in the industry who know that would be opening it. So that's another thought. People don't know fixed route from this, from that, until you help educate them about it. So here's a question or a thought I'm going to throw out to you around this for a moment. Have you, when we're looking at wanting to recruit and hire people during this time, would you want to look at that authentic video and let people see your different openings in your organization and what this really literally looks like? I think people in our communities, especially unfortunately with some of the things that were coming out saying you shouldn't be taking transit, it's not safe. In certain parts of this country, that was a heavy message that was hit for a while. So you're looking to hire people who might remember that message. I think maybe something that's showing authentically, this is how we protect ourselves, protect each other, and showing drivers currently today who are in these positions that are doing their work and still providing important work. I think you should consider that being something that's on your website and celebrating those drivers doing this work and featuring them. And that would mean a lot to me as a driver or as someone in maintenance or somewhere else in doing that. And it would also mean something to the community and seeing, oh, look at all these great things they're doing. And it would third and ultimately mean new people coming to you, getting a better understanding by seeing the visual of it, as much as what you either put bullet points about it or however you do that. Will, is there anything coming through for us that I don't want to keep moving if there's anything?
I think right now we're good on the question front.
Okay.
Just a reminder though, for everyone to put those in the chat box if you have any questions or comments about anything we're talking about.
Okay. Then I'm going to move us through our last major topic here, which is succession planning. And some of you, if you didn't see the questions we put out earlier, but leadership and succession planning, the other thing I was hearing was quite a few people did say succession planning for many organizations was acknowledged in the question I asked, where they said, so far to this point, we've always focused on the top leader, our general manager, executive director, and succession planning, and we haven't expanded it beyond that capability. And we'd like to do that. And how do we approach that? Because the COVID-19 has meant certain people are deciding not to come back to work. And they're in these senior positions and they have this amount of knowledge that now won't be passed on to anyone. Now, I would put out this thought. If this is impacting you now, where you have had people in positions that are very critical and they're not coming back, and you have that knowledge base they have, and you're very concerned as to how to do this, then what one agency said to me I'm doing is, they're taking a few weeks break. Yeah, they definitely are. And then we agree that next month in September, they're coming back as a consultant They're putting together what we've outlined as this kind of overview of the critical pieces they do and have done around this work. And they're going to elevate it to another level because they think so highly of them and the work that they've done, that they're going to have them be a mentor. And this is going to be an as needed basis kind of mentorship. And there's some things that they're defining around that, but they don't see succession planning as something within this point of time and then it stops. They want to have a robust program, and they said, we're fortunate that this person is such a critical person that has this capability, and they've agreed for us to work with them to identify a mentor program to mentor people who we want to then be trained and elevated to this next level on some of their capabilities. I liked it. I thought it's very creative. I hadn't heard that kind of approach before, and these times led them to that. And they're not going to lose then that person until it mutually, comes to that end or unilaterally does. But they said not for a while, because they were very critical to us, and it would have meant a lot if just suddenly it was over. So when it comes to looking at leadership and succession planning, it can be in anywhere in your organization. It can be that driver who has been very responsible that you want to move them up to a frontline supervisor position, let's say, as much as it can be senior leadership. So this investment and developing around people is something critical to retaining and recognizing people as well. So part of that succession planning is having an individual development plan. Literally, that's what it's called, where not waiting just for my review annually, although that's a good time to make a decision as leaders and decide this, but it also, as I think a critical time we would agree, to also say, let's have certain points throughout the year that we're going to make sure there's a whole progression going on, which is the ideal of this person, depending upon where they are in their development. So doing an analysis, our HR role, and there is, as we know, a critical role in this, whether you're an organization who has one HR person or you're part of several people or however your HR is put together, you decide, do we internally want to have a project where we're overseeing it, or do we need a consultant because they have better expertise? At the very top levels, it's always at very senior leaders that we're looking to engage the board of directors at a minimum, even though we want them aware of us doing it throughout the organization, but they should be engaged in it. And if you have strategic plans, and that's part of your strategy strategically, as it should be, and updated regularly, you're meant to be the driver and supporter, and making sure that there's a culture and an actual process developed around this. And I'm a big fan of the individual development plan, or IDP is how you know that term, to very specifically take a form and a structure that you then actually do note everything out and how that's going to go. So on the road, when you're looking at vacancies, skills and knowledge to replace, internal people, how you want to recruit someone externally, if you want to at another organization that you've come to know does great work, and can you lure them away and come to work for you? I mean, there's certain strategic things that if you want to do that, you want to get it into that format. So employees like to know if not all employees want to move up, and we're glad they don't. We want people who want to be drivers and do that very well. But when there's that purpose and that focus around succession planning, when I surveyed all of the people who responded out of the 40 people about succession planning, what I did learn is this: 63% of the people who replied do not have any succession plan at all. 24% of the people who replied says, we've started to discuss it now. It's on the table. And 12% said succession planning is only for the general manager, and we have not looked to expand it beyond that. So whether you call it succession planning, whether you call it individual development plans, however you want to articulate that, when it's formalized, people believe in it. It makes sure it gets done. What's expected will get done when we actually have a plan around it. And it's part of a retention, recognition, like we said, and whether it means supporting it with mentoring, supporting it with people who need to have online training, classroom training, however you structure it, since it'll be individualized for each person as you envision it. I think COVID-19 has taught us in a hard way that at times for some organizations, this is something that's been missing that we now need to take the time to incorporate into the development of leaders and to support those leaders moving up as much as those who are currently there and having that in a very formal process. So when you identify key and intentional employees and how you're going to target them and mentor them and cross-train them and charting that all out almost literally in that way, and their individual goals, all we say is what we always say with this recognition and work focus. Please just keep giving me feedback. I need to know, I want to do better. So how are we going to structure that? Because that's where things often fall down, where people don't feel, who are new to this and being developed, that they get enough feedback. So career mapping is a term you may or may not know that many of you will probably say we're doing that. You can even tie performance to compensation if you want to develop a structure, which I have seen some organizations do around succession planning, whereas they identify certain key areas that someone's moving up to, that there's something to recognize good work that goes beyond your standard compensation, where they do have a kind of bonus around that. So if you want to know more about that, I will gladly share that with you, but I found it interesting that several of your peer transit organizations connected this planning process and succession planning into a system when things are being accomplished, because some agencies have said it's going to be many years, Karen, until someone might be leaving that position and another person's coming in. So as we're developing them and giving them more responsibility and all those things to internally make a commitment to try to get that person there, as our policies say that we will promote internally first and look internally first within and then look outside, do we mutually do both? And how do we compensate with that additional work and development and proof of what's being done? So they make that connection that way, which I understand and appreciate why they do. So has this led to any kind of questions as I went through some of these things at all, Will?
We don't have anything yet, but I would be interested, Karen, in asking you a question, if you have a second, about the social media aspect again, and going back to kind of posting that Indeed and having that more humanized
yes,
descriptor for the job. And I was just curious, in your research and talking to those organizations that had been successful at it, I know you highlight those keywords there, but if there's any other sort of, you know, lines or specific things to focus on, you know, the one we kind of looked at showed a difference between, you know, saying leadership position that does X, Y, and Z in very cold terms, and how to kind of humanize that. If you have any kind of thoughts around that.
Well, what I did learn, and I always follow up with the agencies I've worked with who've changed their ads completely and went with a whole new approach to ask, you know, give enough time, of course, like all of us have to have the ads run, and what does this lead to? And what I did find from them is, yes, it's something new, we all acknowledge, so that gets new eyes on something. That's a normal thing. But you're trying to determine, not after you get after the new phase, you know, is it still having people saying, I saw your ad, or this pulled me in, or whatever. And the key words that they said pulled people in who were not from the industry was describing that this is a friendly environment, because they weren't sure how to think the people they're transporting. They didn't know how to assume who exactly am I bringing from here to there, especially with ADA service and the special needs of ADA. As much as you're saying, I'm looking for people that are welcoming and I need an attitude like that, some of these attitudes that every organization has their own mission and attitudes that they would say, these are the attitudes I'm looking for in a driver. Someone who wants to listen to our rules and regulations and be safe, yes. Someone willing to accept that these are things we have to do. And let's say you're securing someone in a wheelchair and it's not negotiable. At the same time, someone who's reassuring, I need a driver who will reassure people, or, you know, that they're going to certain communities. So this led, by the way, Will, to this version below of safe and friendly and, being willing to help people and connecting to the community. That word community to many drivers, to our community, to your community, very local, also meant a lot to them when they understood what the community is. So if the community happened to be that you were going to be helping senior citizens, oh, that's something that in that initial painting the picture helped get people to open and look at things more. So it's a good question.
Yeah.
So I wanted to let you all know there is a course that we have online that we'll put a link up to about how to hire, recruit, and retain drivers. And it has the branding exercise as part of it. So we do have a resource online for that, just to let you know if at some point you wanted to go very deep into this process. It focuses on building a sustainable driver workforce, but everything that's covered in that 4-hour self-paced, course, you just do it as you want to, covers and it applies to no matter what the position is. But the emphasis on the course was on building a sustainable driver workforce, the retention and recruitment, both parts of that. So if you need a resource to dive deep in, where we were working in Missouri and working with every single transit agency in the room in Missouri and their feedback based on this discussion for that authentic feedback about that, that is a way to look at that. I just thought I'd mention that to you because we have a virtual training online school, and that's one of our courses in it.
Yeah, so another question then, going back to the shortening the application process and kind of
Yes.
trying to get people through a screener versus filling out a full application to begin with.
Right.
The question is, how can you make, when you are a government agency, how can you make the application obtain the information needed and not discriminate?
I have this question a lot because many people one-on-one will say to me, I wish I had the ability, Karen, to do something different than the standard form that my government agency requires. I said, this is not a fun conversation for you to have, but when you show, I would take my driver turnover data information to have a conversation with whoever's responsible, and might not be easy to always determine who oversees these forms. I think the point I've said is, in wanting an online form that's briefer, you're 100% saying anyone that we will be interviewing formally in an interview, we will have them do the full application, 100%, no budge on it. We will meet this requirement that you want at the county agency. Absolutely. However, I can't even get enough people applying to us or filling anything out, and here's my data. And you can ask those social media platforms to show you the data when you put if you do the free online ad as much as the ones where you're paying a fee, and showing this data for us, not for the rest of the world, for our agency, shows the open rate was something horrific. No one is even pulling up and opening this, but they did show us in the data, which they can, but look, it showed that they were hovering on the application and started it. And now it shows how many people closed out of it. We have to do something different here. And I know change is tough on me and it's tough on us. And I know as a county agency, I'm going to still fulfill your mandate. If we're going to interview someone, they will be filling out that application. I'm saying, work with me on this and allow this shorter one, and I will work with you and let's come up with a shorter application. I'll put forward my proposal to you of the shorter application, and I won't just leave you out of it and go rogue on my own. I'm not saying that. I'm approaching you because this is the problem.
So I think
I'm not saying you're going to get where you want to be. I know realistically some of them will tell you, nice try, but no. But I have had some people have some success on it when they take the data and prove that we are going nowhere fast and my turnover rate is X, horrific percent. Help me here. I can't, there's nothing else I can do without your help.
Right. I think another thing that comes to the top of my mind just on that is when you're using that kind of shorter, I'm going to call it a screener application for just the here. Is that being used everywhere? So is that even going to be then what changes on the county website when you're posting a
No,
job?
the county website would never do that. That's your transit agency website.
Got it.
So I know we're already at the end of our coming up, not yet, but coming close to the end of our time.
Mhm.
But you're right, Will. I mean, if somebody would allow you to do that, that'd be wonderful, but they absolutely won't. You're just asking, good point for your transit agency. Can you do that? Um, does this lead to other questions that anyone else has yet?
There's nothing else in the chat box, but if anyone, we're coming up on time, so if anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat
Or
box.
comments?
Yeah, or comments if you have any answers to any of the questions we have posed.
You know what I thought though? This is a tough one that several of your peers, when I called them after the survey, said to me that they've never had to lay off staff ever or a furlough. And they said, some of them said, I did the best I could with looking at SHRM and other ways to counsel and coach me on this. Some are in a union environment, some are non-union. Many people said this reemphasizes again why having a complete, well-done review process and looking at how we review people as to who is doing the work and at that exceptional, outstanding, or close to that level are the people we always want to have stay with us if we have to lay people off, as much as those who are not performing to that level that are still employed by us. So some went a very classic, traditional, no budge way, or the county tells them to, where they're told, last person in is the first person that we lay off, period. Some instead have flexibility and are not under those strict structures. And so they are looking at the discussion with the senior leadership team, looking at the reviews and saying, these top performers are who we would call back first, and so on. If you have the flexibility to do that, we know it's ideal. That's the tie-in with when people are saying reviews are tough. If I have a large amount of people in an organization, it's reward, recognition, giving feedback to employees at a formal time. But when it comes to layoffs, furloughs, this is the critical things when it comes to the legal part of protecting an organization and employees, as much as the practical part of it. So in looking at that, a layoff, again, as a reminder, is a temporary suspension. When you're looking at someone who is being furloughed, it legally is called a mandatory temporary leave of absence. Well, mandatory temporary leave of absence, Karen. Okay, that's a furlough. And then a layoff is a temporary suspension of permanent, all these words jumbling together. We get the words, but what does it mean? When you're furloughed in general, this is what that means. You keep your benefits. This includes, for example, your health benefits, if that's what you have, and your life insurance, for example. You also retain your employment rights when you're furloughed, meaning you cannot be fired during your furlough. So that's how a furlough is looked at. It's temporary, yes, is what a furlough is. Employees still have their jobs, they're coming back, but they also have their benefits. When you're laying off or collectively having to lay off a whole group of people for business reasons, reducing the size of your organization, that's typical the layoff status that's going. I'm not going to be calling you back to work. We're no longer having this category here. This group is being laid off. So when you ever have to consider it, or when you were considering this in the past and wondering, did I do this right? That's the two distinctions that are very clear in a furlough versus a layoff for your considerations. When it comes to a furlough, you're allowed to be furloughed legally for up to 1 year. Not that any of you are planning on that, I don't mean that, but that's part of what's allowed under a furlough legally within that context. Now, in talking of layoffs and furloughs and the tough work that maybe some of you have not ever had to do before, and some of you have again, it's always based, of course, on the needs of your organization as you identify them and as leadership identifies them. In calling people back, you might have some people in that COVID-19 example saying, I don't want to come back right now. I'm afraid of the cleanliness. I don't feel safe, this and that. I gave resources to that, how to answer those questions that we all want to read and see, because maybe no one said that to you yet, but what if that does come up? And it's not just a laid off or a furloughed employee, but that comes up in another context with someone. So there are those examples of how to look at that and what to say around that, that we provided to you in those earlier links. That'll should be a helpful resource for you.
Just one quick kind of diving a little deeper into the furlough. Do you know, Karen, if furlough, I guess this might depend on the agency, but do they still earn vacation and sick leave during that time?
Yes.
Okay.
So some people said with the CARES Act money, and quite a few of you, I think, would probably think we've done this too. They wanted to reward their staff as they were coming back to work, or they've been working throughout this time in some capacity, and they broke down bonuses in different ways, different structures. Every agency's told me something different who's made this decision to take some CARES Act money to do it. Several of them were concerned in increasing an hourly wage and doing that approach, feeling when the CARES Act money is gone, that they weren't sure they could maintain that. So instead, they made a decision to go into a bonus recognition and taking that approach. And so different approaches, different ways. But our CARES Act money, except for our, unfortunately, for the 5310 funded providers, that I know you heard earlier from Scott, we've been fighting that battle for you all along, but I know you're in a different status when you don't have that CARES Act money. But for the rest of us who have access to CARES Act money, the bonus seemed to be what I heard proportionally more about wanting to recognize their staff during this time. And that's what it's allowed to be used for, among many other things, for your operating costs and everything else.
So I think we're about at our time.
Okay.
We don't have any other questions, unless last call, I guess, for questions or comments.
Or comments.
In the chat box here, but
we certainly hope what we've gone over with you during this time is something in the linked information and other aspects of this that has resonated with you, with some thoughts around it, reinforce things you're doing well or things you're going to work on a little bit more. There's quite a bit of tools there, and please email or call me if there's something else that you didn't want to in the general forum, wanted to discuss. That's what we're here to do, to support you, as I know you know, and I thank you for joining us.
So I just put the next link to our next session in the chat box, everyone. So you have a couple minutes to go grab a snack or a cup of coffee, but I hope to see you all there.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. See you in the upcoming sessions.